Greetings Dr. Wang and Mr. Afiq. Today I'll be presenting on a war journalist going by the name of Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle was a Pulitzer Prize winning war journalist and correspondent. Some background on Mr. Ernie Pyle over here. He was born Ernest Taylor Pyle and he was given a nickname called Ernie. He was born on August 2nd, 1900 near Dana, Indiana, in rural Vermilion County, which is a county located in the state of Indiana. Ernie Pyle enlisted in the U.S. Navy Reserve during World War One. The war ended before he could actually be transferred overseas for further training and to be put into the field. After the war, he actually enrolled in Indiana State University in 1919 to study journalism. He worked there on a student newspaper, which was called Indiana Daily Student. During his year studying, he took a semester off to travel overseas to explore the world alongside some of his fraternity brothers before continuing his studies. They traveled to places like Japan, to Hong Kong, to Shanghai, and to Manila, all countries with strong American naval bases nearby. And now we move on to his career. And I separated his career into multiple parts to help better explain and to separate moments of his life. First, we'll go to his first footsteps into journalism. He started as a reporter in the Washington Daily News in 1923. This was a new tabloid newspaper ran by Scrip Howard newspaper conglomerate. He began as a copy editor. He began as a reporter, and he eventually became a copy editor soon after. After that, he quit his job in 1926 alongside his wife Geraldine Jerry to travel across America. During this time, he actually noted down his journeys in America, visiting other people, as well as some of his interactions with the locals while he was journeying across. After that, he returned to the Daily News in December of 1927 to work on one of its first and best known aviation columns. This is a quote by Amelia Earhart. Any aviator who didn't know Pyle was a nobody. Amelia Earhart was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, setting off an entire change in the aviation industry and bringing in more women into aviation, the flying. And he worked on this aviation column for about 4 years. Moving on to his second part, in 1932, Ernie Pyle was named managing director at the Daily News where he worked, and he served for that position for 3 years. After his extended vacation in 1934, he returned to the paper to fill in for vacationing columnists. He wrote a series of 11 articles that talked about his trip during his vacation and the people that he met. This series was well liked by both the readers and his fellow colleagues in the newspaper. And this style of writing much more personal story, much more down to earth, and more of a feature writing, actually made coupled together with his prior military background, helped start up his future career in war journalism, and it really cemented his position in the eyes of the American public, and he became a really well-liked author and a writer. In 1935, Ernie Pyle left his position at the Daily News to write his own national column as a roving reporter for human interest stories for the Scripps Howard newspaper syndicate. And now we move on to part 3. This was when which was also known as World War II. He was a war journalist. He was a journalist during this time, and he was sent to London in 1940s to cover the Battle of Britain. And after reporting the news, and he went to America, and he returned back to Europe in 1942 as a war correspondent for the Scripps and Howard newspaper. He would go on to describe the war from the perspective of a common soldier while he reported on the front lines. And this would continue a trend in his reporting and in his photography, where he would often take photos and write news from the position of the common folk, for those people from in the front lines, in the trenches. He writes stories about them and from their eyes. And he got to know a lot of soldiers and generals very well during this period. Powell later joined the American troops in in North Africa, and in Europe from 1942 to 1944, and the Asiatic Pacific Theater in 1945. Powell's newspaper columns from the campaigns that he covered include "Here Is Your War" in 1943 and "The Brave Men" in 1944. Through his work, Ernie became friends with a lot of enlisted men and women, as well as those in leadership positions, like General Omar Bradley and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower would eventually go on to become America's 34th president. During this period, he also fought for the rights of soldiers in combat to get fight pay, which is like a bonus pay for soldiers who go to the front lines and fight, which is something very similar with the Air Force's flight pay, where they will pay 50% more for soldiers who are fighting in planes and who are actually flying the planes over war zones. In 1944, the US Congress passed a law that authorized 50% extra pay for the combat service. This law, would become known as the Ernie Pyle Bill. Continuing on part 3, he then landed with American troops in on Normandy at D-Day. A quote from Pyle himself: "The best way I can describe this vast armada and the frantic urgency of the traffic is to suggest that you visualize New York City on its busiest day of the year, and then just enlarge the scene until it takes in all the ocean the human eye can reach, clear around the horizon and over the horizon. There are dozens of times that many." After covering the D-Day and Normandy and the storming of Normandy Beach, he took a rest at his home in New Mexico in hopes that it would restore his vigor to go warhorsing around the Pacific. After this, Pyle reluctantly headed for the Pacific Theater in January of 1945. These are some of the photos of Ernie Pyle that he took during Normandy during D-Day. This was him talking to a general and a soldier that was shot in the trenches. Much of his photograph and his work, like I said before, were focused on the people during the war, the common folk and soldiers itself. Part 4, Pacific Theater. While covering the US Navy and Marine forces in the Pacific, Pyle challenged the US Navy's policy that forbid the use of the names of soldiers in reporting of the war. He won a partial victory that the rule would be lifted for him and him alone. He was unsatisfied with this ruling because he wanted other journalists during the era to be able to report on the names of soldiers. He really wanted to highlight and to make the American public know who is fighting for their freedom, for their rights, while overseas. Because he did not want the soldiers to be just another statistic to the American people. He wanted the American people to know of their stories. Pyle will go on to report on the naval action during the Battle of Okinawa. These are some of the photos that he took or pictures of him during the Pacific Theater. This is him talking to some soldiers, and this is him going towards being carried to another ship across. Looking at the caption, this is a photo of him on the roadside on the shore in Okinawa, and alongside a lot of the American Navy soldiers and a lot of other soldiers as well. And this is where I would have to be honest with you and saying that I have slightly misled you before this, in that the previous photo, this photo here, is of Ernie Pyle himself. He was shot and killed in Iwo Jima, which the American Navy would later would refer to it as Iwo Jima. And to quote the American President Harry S. Truman, "No man in this war has so well told the story of the American fighting man as American fighting man wanted it told. He deserves the gratitude of all his countrymen. When President Truman talked about Ernie Pyle. As I said before, he died of a gunshot wound in Iwo Jima. His death was really sorely mourned by the army because he had become a very beloved icon to the nation and in particular to the soldiers in the front lines because they saw him as one of themselves, as a fellow soldier in the front lines defending America. He was the one who told American soldiers their stories of the American soldiers to the public and how they wanted it told. In 1944, a column written by Ernie Pyle for the Scripps and Howard newspaper earned a Pulitzer Prize. Hollywood would go on to make a movie based on it, and Ernie would insist on the films, including fellow war correspondents, playing themselves. He was killed before the film was released. This is Ernie Pyle's gravestone, and it is located in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii. And I'll go into some detail of his style of writing and photography. He had a very simple style of photography. He would put the focus directly on the soldiers and the people in the trenches. And that is reflected in his own writing. It's very simple, very down to earth, very very feature, very like people focused. And often the photographs would feature Bernard himself interacting or talking with the soldiers over there. And I would like to end this presentation with the opening words of Ernie Pyle's last letter. And so it ends. Thank you.